So thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kate Anstey, and I am the lead for Child Poverty Action Group's Cost of School Day project across the UK. I'm also joined today by my colleague Dave Bradley, who heads up our work across England. And then I'm really pleased as well to be joined by two guest speakers. So we've got Celeste Pergolizzi from the National Children's Bureau. We've also got Kirsty Yates joining us from Parentkind, and they're going to talk through some of their kind of recent work with us, which is great. So firstly, some kind of housekeeping. I think we're all sort of used to this by now. We're going to try and stick very closely to our 1 hour slot, so everybody should be able to head off at 3. Please do kind of use the chat function just to introduce yourselves. Kind of down on your, please do introduce yourselves, but also just post any kind of helpful links or ask any questions in there as we go along. Dave and I are going to attempt to sort of monitor it as we go through and respond to any questions that we can, but I'm sure lots of people have things to say as well, so feel free to kind of throw things in there. We'll also hopefully have time for a bit of a panel discussion at the end, so if you've got any, I suppose, kind of bigger questions to put to the panel, if you can put those into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll try and sort of make some time to kind of go through those. Hang on. So in terms of our format for today, I'm going to speak a bit about the kind of big picture in terms of COVID-19 and its impact on child poverty, just to help kind of set the scene. And then we're going to move into some of the main messages from our recent report, which hopefully you've all heard about by now, the cost of learning in lockdown. And as we go along, Dave and I are going to just try and pull out some really kind of practical solutions and examples, as well as then looking at some of our kind of key recommendations from the report. Then I'm going to hand over to Celeste, who's going to talk about a campaign that NCB have been running this week. And then we'll hear from Kirsty, who's going to talk about some research as well as a new survey that's been released. And then, as I said, hopefully we'll have time for that sort of panel discussion at the end. So, oh gosh, oh no. Right, excellent. So, as I said, sort of firstly, the impact of COVID-19 on child poverty. I think the first thing to say is that lots of this kind of won't be news to many of you. I know that lots of you have been out there on the front line kind of over the past few months supporting families in lots of different ways, and you'll be really aware of some of the difficulties that people are facing. But I think it's just really important to sort of set the scene so we're really clear about the scale of the current situation. And there's a very sort of common metaphor that you probably already heard, but I think it's really useful. And that's just that we've all been in the same kind of big COVID storm, but we're all in very different boats. And I think the very kind of clear point is that some people will be able to stay afloat during this crisis, but lots of others will be pulled under by poverty. And as my colleague kind of put it, some people have been given life jackets in terms of various government support schemes, but others will have slipped through the net. So this crisis has made people who are already kind of struggling financially become even more vulnerable than before. Before the crisis, and I think this is kind of quite shocking, it was estimated that more than 4 million households in the UK wouldn't be able to cope if their income dropped below or sort of dropped by 25% within the month. And I suppose since that point, we know that over 9 million people have been furloughed. And so lots of those people will be living on 80% of their usual wages. I think we also know lots and lots of jobs have kind of gone altogether. And since the beginning of March, there have been over 3 million new claims to universal credit. And so I suppose in terms of what that means for child poverty, while we don't know the kind of exact figures, it's been estimated that around 200,000 children will be pushed further into or pushed into poverty as a result of the crisis. So in terms of what this actually means for families and children, it means kind of the same as what poverty has always meant, but we're just in a particularly sort of unique situation and on a much larger scale. So for families, it means stress and worry and not having enough for your family to get by. There was some kind of recent research released by JRF and Save the Children, and that kind of showed a bit more about what this means, I suppose, kind of practically for families. And what we heard through that research is that 7 in 10 families on benefits are having to cut back on essentials, and around 50% are cutting back on food. We also heard that 6 in 10 are borrowing money, and over 5 in 10 are sort of behind on rent or other essential bills. So I think as well as these being very kind of worrying statistics, they're also just very stressful and significant changes to family life. And as many of you will know and will have seen, these changes can also have a huge impact on kind of family well-being. There was a research piece by Young Minds that showed that children and young people are experiencing kind of significantly reduced well-being during lockdown. And we'll definitely kind of come on to that more later on in the presentation. So I think it's really fair to say that as pupils return to school, it's kind of highly likely that children will be in very different financial situations than they were previously. And some will be kind of pushed further into poverty, while others will be experiencing it for the very first time. I think importantly, and I think this is a good sort of really useful thing to think about, is that the typical data that we might go to help us understand sort of children living in poverty and numbers, that actually won't be that useful anymore. So children will still be in the same households that they lived in previously. So the kind of IMD data won't tell us much. They might not be eligible for free school meals because they might sit above that threshold, or they may have not applied yet. So we can't necessarily look at that data. And maybe families sort of haven't been able to or haven't wanted to disclose their situation yet to anybody. So I think it's this idea that it's going to be really difficult for us to know who exactly is struggling and who might need support. In terms of sort of the education sector, I think what this means for us is that we need to be even more poverty aware and just ensure that policies and practices throughout school have a poverty lens to them and are designed in a way that ensures we're kind of reducing any financial pressure on families, and that way kind of ensuring that children don't miss out as a result of their income. So what role does our kind of cost of school day project play in all of this? The UK project was originally set up in partnership with Children North East, and our aim together has been to support whole school communities and local authorities across the UK to identify and kind of overcome any cost barriers that might be preventing children from participating in sort of all parts of school life. Normally this work is sort of taking place in schools, and we'd be out there talking to children and young people all about the school day and helping to kind of poverty-proof schools across the UK. And since schools have kind of closed down to most pupils, we've adapted the project, but we've just continued to kind of look at this question of how income affects children's experiences of learning and education while they've been learning at home. So one of the ways that we've done this, and kind of the reason that we're sort of here today to share these findings, is that we carried out a big piece of research called The Cost of Learning in Lockdown. We asked children and families all across Britain about their experiences of school closures. We heard back quite surprisingly from lots of families, which was brilliant. So we heard from 3,600 parents and around 1,300 children and young people. And in particular, we wanted to understand the experiences of low-income households. So we worked with a range of organisations to ensure that our survey kind of reached families who might be struggling with money. So through the survey, we asked families about a really kind of broad range of things, and all the things sort of linked to school closures. So we looked at learning materials and resources. We looked at how free school meals have been replaced across the UK. We asked families about sort of advice and signposting that they'd received around financial support, as well as any kind of additional support they've been given about sort of around family wellbeing. And finally, we really wanted to know kind of what family priorities were as children, as and when they kind of returned to school. So all the way throughout the report, we've really sort of aimed to shine a light on a lot of the really, really kind of brilliant practices that schools and councils have implemented that have really helped families to cope and manage during lockdown. But we've also sort of looked at what more could be done to ensure pupils in low-income households don't miss out, both kind of now, but also during any periods of home learning in the future. And I suppose kind of one of the key findings or the kind of really big thing that came up for us was just that these financial pressures and cost burdens that are associated with school closures are kind of falling heaviest on those families that can least afford it. So we'll kind of come back to that, but I think that's sort of a key takeaway. So I will move on to our survey findings now. To terms of home learning resources, we asked children and parents kind of what their experience of home learning was since lockdown started. And in particular, we wanted to look at kind of resources, and we found that 40% of low-income families were missing at least one essential resource that could be used to support their children's learning. In particular, we heard that there were kind of lots of challenges around ICT, with families describing kind of sharing phones in order to do work, or using incompatible devices, or not having devices at all. So I think the way to put it is just, we've had this kind of huge shift to digital learning as a result of the pandemic. But in order to take part in it, you really require, or you really need, the kind of appropriate technology. And lots of parents, or in families where this wasn't the case, kind of shared a lot of concerns that their children weren't able to access the same learning as others. They were very worried that kind of less learning was taking place. But they were also kind of witnessing children going through a lot of frustration and feeling very cut off from school and from their classmates. In terms of what we heard from children and young people, they told us that what they liked most about home learning was being able to sort of be in touch with teachers very regularly online. They really appreciated any kind of regular feedback or opportunities for clarification, and just anything that helped to kind of keep the link alive between the school and home was very much kind of appreciated by children and young people. And throughout the kind of survey, we just heard how schools have gone to really sort of amazing lengths to ensure that children sort of have these opportunities to ask questions regularly. We heard lots about kind of virtual classrooms being set up so children could work alongside peers. And just lots of children felt that they could contact teachers whenever it was needed. So it was really positive. However, and I suppose this again sort of links back to what I was saying, a lot of this relied on having the right resources. And where that wasn't the case, it was just so much harder for children to engage and kind of benefit from everything that was on offer. In particular, I suppose we heard from secondary school pupils, and they were much more likely to report that they'd done a lot of schoolwork if they were in regular contact with teachers. So I think that's really important. We also found that people who told us they were worried about their financial circumstances were kind of more likely to have bought resources. So this is kind of the point I was making earlier. And that included things like printers, buying access to internet. But we also, I think, kind of really worryingly heard that 1 in 3 of those who had kind of extreme money worries, so they were sort of 10 out of 10 on our scale, had actually bought a laptop or device, so quite an expensive item. I think this just illustrates the point that families are really sort of trying to keep up, despite not having adequate income to do so. And I just kind of want to make the point here, and I think it's really important that I think there's sort of lots of assumptions that low-income families don't engage as much with their children's learning. I think what we saw from the survey is just kind of level of care and concern from parents was really, really overwhelming. But often lots of them face kind of multiple challenges that were very difficult to overcome. So now we're going to move on to talk a bit about food provision, and I suppose in particular we focused on free school meal replacements. And what we heard kind of first and foremost from families was just how much they really appreciated free school meal replacements. So lots and lots of families really praised the support that schools and local authorities had provided them in kind of such uncertain times. Lots of families talked about the kind of increasing costs of having children at home all day, and some of them described free school meal replacements as a kind of absolute lifeline, especially as many reported that their financial circumstances had changed quite significantly as a result of the pandemic. So I think, as we'll probably all be aware, free school meals are sort of being replaced in different ways in different places. And I think it's worth saying at this point that in Scotland and Wales, sort of local authorities have generally been given responsibility for setting up alternative free school meal provision during the crisis. And many local authorities in Scotland and Wales, and particularly in Wales, have opted to do this through direct payments to people's bank accounts. So this kind of method of replacement was very much included in our analysis work. And so in terms of what we found, while different replacements really did work well for different families, we heard particularly positive things about direct payments to families as a method, and it kind of had by far the highest satisfaction levels, with 81% of families who were receiving payments saying it was kind of working well for them. And 90% of families said that they would kind of choose to continue receiving support in that way. So we tried to sort of unpick this and understand a bit more about why cash payments were working well, and also, I suppose, what was important to families when they're receiving this entitlement. And I'll just kind of talk you through some of the things that we heard. So firstly, it was really important to families, or they really kind of valued having choice. They wanted to choose the shops that provided the best value for their budgets, and also choose food that they kind of knew their children would eat. So this was particularly important when children had sort of certain specific dietary requirements. Families also told us that they really valued accessibility. So they appreciated being able to shop locally where it's convenient for them, but also be able to shop online if needed. And again, that was really important for kind of shielding families. We heard that shopping became sort of much more challenging and sometimes even impossible when families were required to travel further, often having to take kind of young children with them. Really importantly, families valued discretion. So we heard particularly how cash payments removed any kind of embarrassment or shame that families felt about receiving this entitlement. Families also talked to us about safety. Some were nervous about going to collect food packages, having to travel, or also being kind of in busy supermarkets. So feeling safe was really important to families, and this came with kind of having choice of where they shopped and how. And finally, and I think this is something that we can all kind of appreciate, families really valued an efficient process. So many families receiving direct payments commented on how easy the process was during a really difficult time, and particularly in local authorities where it was sort of automated. Families talked about the sort of incredible relief of not having to fill out forms. Unfortunately, we did hear from a number of families who'd had quite severe delays and technical issues with the National Voucher Scheme in England, and this had kind of caused a lot of frustration and stress during an already kind of a stressful period. So those are kind of, as I say, a lot of the things that families really valued, and that often was achieved through cash payments. I think it's sort of important to note that other replacements were effective as well in certain places. So now I'm going to hopefully hand over to Dave to carry on.
Great, thank you, Kate. So I'm going to take us through the next few sections and on to going through our recommendations as well. As Kate said at the beginning, one of the things we were also keen to look at was how families and children were being supported with the new financial circumstances that they might find themselves in. To set the scene on what we heard from parents and carers was that over half of the respondents came back to say that they had experienced a change in their financial circumstances throughout the school closures. When you couple this with many of them reporting back that money was tighter because they were spending more on gas, electricity and food than they normally would, it began to really paint a picture for families where they were becoming financially constrained by two separate measures. Our research really illustrated as well how much schools had become the go-to for some financial support for families, and as Kate already highlighted, the extent to that schools were that support was consistent throughout. Families really valued schools who were sharing information with them, particularly when it was tailored to their individual needs. We saw there was amazing case studies of schools who parents described as giving constant reassurances if we needed any help. All we had to do was to get in contact with them, and they were the best that they would do. So I think what that showed was that families could be part of that wider community, and the school was able to keep them connected and help them feel supported throughout that time when often many of the usual channels were busier than normal or hard to access. Something that we were really interested that the survey found was that the more parent and carers were concerned about their financial situation, the more likely they were to have bought or purchased the different learning resources that we put in the survey. What this really showed was that less financially secure households were twice as likely to have purchased printers or other digital devices, and 4 times as likely to have invested in internet access around the school closures. For us, this showed two really distinct things. It showed that before the school closures, there was already a resource and digital gap that existed between households and schools, and the current crisis has really shone a spotlight on that. But what it really showed too was that regardless of levels of financial concern, many families had proactively made the decision to support learning at home and to make sure that their children were not missing out to the best of their abilities. The next section that parents told us about was around family wellbeing. And despite lockdown and despite the enormous tasks faced by teachers and schools, many of them were still able to provide high valued and high quality wellbeing support for families, often by taking the time to contact families directly and simply ask them how they were coping. Many schools helped to alleviate some of the stress and worries that families have been experiencing throughout this time. A mum of two said that, "I'm really not sure that anything more could have been done at the moment. All teachers are working extremely hard in a situation we've never been in before." I think that really helped to illustrate to the extent to which families appreciated being able to liaise easily with their school and also to receive regular updates. This was particularly effective when it was done through a variety of communication channels and parents were able to get the information in a way that was best for them. What really helped with family wellbeing as well was being constantly engaged in the school community and hearing directly from teachers, but also from fellow classmates. This really helped pupils to stay engaged and really helped for them to keep the sense of the community and they were missing from what was often a socially isolated time. Although we had loads of great practice about how schools use digital platforms to be contactable throughout this time, families really wanted more of that kind of constant emotional and pastoral support, and where they could, having regular and constant communications really helped. I think what parents really saw as well was that the school community was going to be crucial in helping to address mental health and well-being concerns that they had about their children. And they really encouraged schools to have more open conversations about mental health and well-being throughout this time, but also when schools return. What is quite cool for today, based on the announcements, we were really keen to hear from families what learning to school should look like from their perspective. We were really keen to hear from children and young people what they were most looking forward to about their return to school. Potentially unsurprisingly, they told us that friends and play was top of their list and something that they really wanted to have central to any return to school, whether that be partial in September. They were really excited to see their teachers be learning in a classroom environment. They really wanted to go back to normal life, having their routines restored, being around their friends, being around their teacher, and a new scene of familiarity. Students were also really excited about re-engaging in their extracurricular opportunities, the things that they really valued about school. The drama clubs, school choir, sports matches and training are all things that they wanted to be able to access as soon as they returned to school. What parents and carers thought as well is equally interesting to us, and Kirsty will probably tap onto some of this later on. Parents and carers really wanted there to be a focus on social and emotional support for students upon their return, a real focus on their children's well-being. But what they really wanted as well was that there'd be guarantees of safety. They wanted a gradual phased return that supported settling in. And above all else, they really wanted good communication and information to be shared consistently prior to and on the reopening of schools. It potentially goes without saying, but they also wanted that time to support with catching up on learning, as many children's experiences would have been very different at home. Throughout the report, you will actually see at the end of each section there are recommendations broken down for schools, for local authorities, and for wider government as well. But we just wanted to put on a couple of these to start with at this stage. With the prospect of returning to school in September, the new guidance today has acknowledged that there may be often partial closures of schools due to positive tests. We think that it's really important that we work across the sector to ensure that all children have the learning tools they need in case of quickly changing scenarios. We've also consistently called for an increase in child benefit by £10 per child per week so that it covers the additional costs that parents are currently facing in a universal way. When schools do return, I think we want there to be a poverty-aware approaches embedded in the schools, making sure that no child feels stigmatized or punitively punished. The research also shows that many families in poverty who are not eligible for free school meals or wider support are struggling financially, and we would really encourage the government to urgently relook at the eligibility criteria. We also think that return to school needs to be done collaboratively. The voices of children and of wider families need to be put at the heart of what's happening, and time needs to be spent on encouraging and developing social and emotional well-being, and allowing children to rebuild relationships with their friends and their new teachers. And if you have time later on, we'll hopefully dig a bit deeper into some of these recommendations. But I hope that gives you a flavour of what the report brings out, and kind of brings out the voices of the parents and children that were kind enough to respond. I'm now going to hand over to Celeste. So I will start with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Celeste. I'm a policy officer at the National Children's Bureau. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So I'm going to talk a bit about Children at the Heart of Recovery campaign, which launched on Tuesday. But before I get into that, I kind of just wanted to give a bit of background to these campaigns and the overall vision. So we like to call these children's moments because they're a moment where the sector kind of stands together, united for children. So the first one of these we did was in 2018. And it involved over 120 organisations coming together and sending a joint letter to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, calling for them to put children at the heart of spending. And the most recent one we've done was in 2019 during the general election, where over 140 organisations came together and sent a joint letter to all party leaders to put children at the heart of the general election, and to set out how their party and their manifestos were focused on children and young people. So the overall aim of these moments and these campaigns is that we focus on babies, children and young people as a whole, rather than on a particular policy issue. And focusing on this children and young people as a whole means we have a great chance of mobilising mass public support. And it also means we can send a very clear message to government and other key stakeholders. And then the second aim of these campaigns is to ensure that children, young people and parent voices are at the heart of the debates that are often affecting them the most, and making sure that their voices are heard. So to give just a quick example with the general election campaign, so as I mentioned, over 140 organisations came together to call on all party leaders to put children at the heart of their campaigns. And as you can see on the left here, we've got some great engagement. Our chief executive, Anna, was on the Victoria Derbyshire show with a representative from Mentivity and a young person. And over here on the left, you can see that there's a representative from the Labour Party and also from the Liberal Democrats, who were asked by the young person what they would do for children and young people if they were in power. We also had some just great engagement with party leaders as well. Jeremy Corbyn went into a school and asked the young person here what they would do if they were Prime Minister, and then tweeted the video, which was great. The Liberal Democrats again highlighted the areas in their manifesto that focus on children and young people. And as you can see on the right, Boris Johnson was actually interviewed during his campaign about the previous campaign in 2018, which called on government to put children at the heart of spending. And believe it or not, that video has over 1 million views, which is great. So that's just to give a bit of an idea of the impacts that these campaigns have at getting children and young people noticed. But the second strand of this campaign was about getting their voices heard. So we asked the 140 organisations who signed up to the letter to work with the children and young people that they already work with to promote their voices on social media using the hashtag #IWerePM. And as you can see here, there was some great engagement. We had videos, we had photos. Children and young people were writing down what they would do if they were Prime Minister and what they wanted whoever was elected to focus on in their government. And it was just honestly really great to see so many organisations promoting children and young people's voices and making sure they were heard. So that kind of brings us to where we found ourselves, you know, a couple months ago, thinking about recovery and recovery from COVID-19. So the key aims just in general with recovery for us are about promoting the key issues facing babies, children and young people during COVID recovery, and raising the voices of children, young people and parents. So with that in mind, the National Children's Bureau, alongside Action for Children, Barnardo's, the Children's Society and the NSPCC, put together a joint statement that we would ask the children's sector to sign up to. And the key messages from this statement are that children, young people and families must be at the heart of COVID-19 recovery, joining health and the economy as the key pillars of the government's coronavirus response. And, you know, alongside that, children, young people and parents' voices must be heard, and they must be consulted in any plans and strategies that the government makes on COVID recovery. But the statement also recognises that things before the pandemic weren't good. They were already bad. Child poverty was rising, education budgets were suffering, children's services were at breaking point. So the key message in the statement is also that we can't just go back to how things were. COVID recovery needs to be about recognising that the issues that existed before the pandemic, acknowledging how those issues have been made worse during the pandemic, and then coming up with a plan to address these issues. So again, the statement calls for an ambitious plan from government designed with children, young people and parents, which prioritises children and enables them to thrive, and that there's renewed investment in the services and the workforce that they rely on. So amazingly, we had over 150 organisations sign up to the statement. And it was brilliant because there were so many organisations who focused on different age ranges. So we had representation from early years to schools to university, loads of organisations who just focus on different issues. So as I was saying before, the focus is on children and young people as a whole, but the amount of organisations coming together means that we can highlight the specific issues that children and young people are facing. And it was really powerful to have the sector come together and call for the same thing. So the statement was launched on Tuesday, and we asked all the organisations who signed up to promote this using the hashtag Children at the Heart on social media. And you know, while that was powerful, what was even more powerful was again promoting children and young people and parents' voices. So as you can see here, children and young people and parents got involved in the campaign, and they set out the impacts that COVID-19 and lockdown has had on them, and also set out what they would like the government to focus on in terms of COVID recovery. So again, we had videos, we had quotes, we had graphics, some children and young people saying what they need from government. We even have here, as you can see in the middle at the bottom, a parent tweeting on behalf of their baby. So I actually encourage you all to go on Twitter and search the hashtag Children at the Heart, because it's really impactful and emotional to scroll through and see all these organisations coming together, calling for the same thing, and children and young people actually joining the call and making their voices heard. So we actually had over 1,200 uses of that hashtag, which was really great. And then we also had some other engagement. So we had a BBC News article there We had lots of parliamentarians getting involved and tweeting their support for the campaign, as you can see here. And I've just cropped it out for space reasons, but they all linked to the NCB website, which has a list of all the 150 signatories and the statement. So it's great to kind of get that out there through them as well. The Children's Commissioner responded, and the Labour Party put out an official response from the Shadow Children's Minister. We also had coverage on ITV, Daily Mail, Nursery World, Children and Young People Now, and over 180 local pieces as well. So next steps, the Chancellor is expected to make a speech next week, where we hope to kind of renew the call that we launched on Tuesday and just kind of respond using children at the heart and promoting children and young people's voices again in response to whatever the Chancellor says next week. So NCB has been working with a coalition of over 20 children's charities to put together a series of papers on recovery. So there's, within those briefings, there's an overarching principles document, which kind of sets out the vision for what recovery for children and young people might look like. So that kind of talks about putting children at the heart, putting children's voices at the heart, integration, cross-government work, things like that. And then we're also hosting a all-party parliamentary group for children event, which kind of builds on the campaign. It builds on recovery briefings, kind of talks about them in more detail. And we're really pleased that the Minister for Children will be in attendance, and that there'll be representatives from the Department of Education, Department of Health and Social Care. And again, at that event, we're very keen to promote children and young people and parents' voices. So they will attend the event, they will present a video to the event about what they need from recovery, and they will just answer any questions from those in attendance as well. So with that in mind, and to practice what I preach, I've got a video from young people themselves, and they're just talking about how lockdown affected them and what they need from government now. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and then to change the settings, and then I'll play the video for you all.
All of the things that make life normal, you know, like seeing your friends. I've lost a lot of opportunities, and I've also lost my sense of independence from it for the time being as well.
I would have finished my GCSEs, I would have been on holiday right now.
It makes you realise how impactful that is on your mental health when it's all just suddenly taken away from you.
The feeling that you've just been, you know, a passenger in all of this, and that you haven't been able to put an input in.
Because I'm a young carer, we've had no government guidance. For us especially, we've been left in the dark.
Throughout this whole process, young people's voices are not heard.
Many young people are concerned about their long-term job prospects after this. Creating a fund to help young people find employment is really helpful.
An acknowledgement and appreciation of mental health kind of struggles that will come out of this.
I'd like to see the government do more for those who are unpaid carers.
Better bereavement support for those of us that have lost loved ones during the pandemic.
I would like the government to prove that they listen.
I would like some guidance for the future, because it's kind of uncertain.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Celeste. That's something really, really powerful to finish on. And thank you for taking the time this morning. I know you have to dash off, but we've really, really appreciated coming on and leading on this really important campaign. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Kirsty, and I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be here this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I am Kirsty Yates, and I am the Research Officer at Parentkind. So I'm going to talk through a couple of pieces of research that we've done over the last few months. But before that, I just wanted to give you a really quick overview of Parentkind. We are a charity that is all about parental engagement. So we inspire and enable parents to take an active role in their child's education so that every child can thrive, because all the evidence shows that if parents are more engaged in their child's learning and education, children will do better. We've been championing parents in education for over 60 years. We're a membership organisation, so we've got approximately 13,000 members who are PTAs. And we also work with schools to develop and promote best practice in parental engagement by providing training and resources for school leaders, staff and governors. So there's various strands to our pieces of work. Obviously, what's happened over the last few months is so significant, and from a parental engagement perspective, it's massive. It's the biggest parental engagement project that has ever taken place. And whilst we do research periodically throughout the year anyway, for example, we do an annual parent survey, and we've got 6 years of data for that now. Because of what was happening, we were really keen to get feedback from parents at various stages of the pandemic, to get feedback from them on how they were feeling and how their children's education was being impacted by the pandemic and school closures. So our very first survey was a really short 6 question survey. I deliberately used open questions in some of the questions. So for example, the question that I asked about what's your biggest concern, I didn't want to preempt responses, so I wanted to get parents' gut reactions on the response to the school closures. Interestingly, we timed it really well in that the survey went out 2 hours before the government announced school closures on the 18th of March. So we only had it open for 5 days because we wanted to get the initial feedback out really quickly, because all of this is so so fast moving. So we wanted to get the results out as soon as we could. So we had 691 respondents to that survey, which represented nearly 1,200 pupils. As I said, we had 6 questions. Initial reactions to school closures, such as how worried parents were about the impact of coronavirus on their child's education. We asked it on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 was not worried at all and 10 was extremely worried. The average came out at 6.8, and although a quarter did say that even at that point they were already extremely worried about the impact on their child's education. Another question that we asked was about the impact of school closures, what that impact on the parents themselves, not specifically the children, but as parents. And as I said, that was an unprompted question. Things like struggling to juggle work and homeschooling came out top. Other people mentioned worries about finances, whether the fact that they'd already been laid off, or had had to reduce the number of hours that they would work because of childcare or lack of it. And then lots of people mentioned high levels of stress, poor mental health. So these were concerns that they were already raising right at the beginning of this pandemic. So we about 6 weeks later, we sort of took the opportunity to ask to write another survey, and this was timed in because they were just starting to talk about schools reopening. So on our second survey, we had questions like how parents were coping, how confident they felt supporting their children's learning, what role they felt they played in that. So whether they were very much a sort of just supporting, or whether they felt that they were actually effectively teaching their children. support received from the school and what they would like, their concerns again. And the killer question on this one was when parents would be happy to send their child back to school. So we launched this on the 23rd of April, and we had it open for about 11 or 12 days. We had a phenomenal response to this. We had over 250,000 parents responding, which was mind-blowing. I mean, I've worked in research for a long time and we have never seen anything like this. It got picked up by lots of key players, including the Department for Education. They shared it on their Facebook post on the Saturday evening, and then it just went crazy. And so we had it. Mumsnet shared it. We had so many organisations sharing it, so it got a massive take up. And also I feel like that highlighted just how much parents want a voice in all of this. They want a say, they want to be heard, they've got things that they want to contribute about this, and this is happening to their children, and it's really important that they are listened to. So I'm just going to flick through some of the responses to this survey in particular, because it's just a bit more current than the first survey. So one of the questions we asked was, how are you coping with the different arrangements for your child's schooling? A quarter were coping really well, another sort of 40% quite well, 25% said it was so-so, and 8% not very well, not at all well. Interestingly, we also asked them how this related back to the beginning of the pandemic, and also what they expected it to be. So a third of the sample felt that it was actually better than they thought it was going to be. About just over half was as it's expected, and a tenth thought that it was actually worse than they expected it to be, which is a shame. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in terms of supporting children, we asked how confident parents felt supporting their children's learning. So we had sort of a fifth of the population saying that they were very confident, another just under half were quite confident, but a quarter was saying that they weren't very confident, and another 8% were not at all confident. And again, how does this compare to at the start of the school closure? So, 6 weeks on, a third were more confident, but actually 16% were less confident than they were back at the beginning of the school closures. So one of the things we asked, bearing in mind that it was becoming quite apparent that this wasn't, that children weren't going to be going back to school straight away, was that we wanted to find out what resources that they would find helpful and to support their children's learning, but also what support they'd actually had from the school. So in terms of the resources that they'd find most helpful, maybe unsurprisingly, live online classes came up top. And then secondly, it was that direct communication between children and their teachers, which is interesting because that was picked up by the research earlier that Kate was referring to, and this, that children were more engaged if they had that direct communication with their teachers. So video clips were also mentioned, and feedback from teachers, and reassurances about learning expectations. Interestingly, that top 5 doesn't quite mirror when you look at what parents and children have been were receiving from their schools. So worksheets came out top. Direct communication was second, which is great, really encouraging. Feedback from teachers again was up there. Reassurances about learning expectations was in there as well, and activities to support their child's well-being were mentioned, so that's good. But key things that were missing: online classes, video clips. Yes. The next, another question that we asked was, how satisfied parents were with the home learning support from their school. So at that point, so at the end of April, 43% said they were very satisfied, and another 39% were quite satisfied. So we actually only had a relatively small percentage of the population that weren't particularly satisfied. So we had 12 not very and 4 not at all satisfied. So at that point, I think that we can conclude that most schools were actually giving parents and children the support that they required to undergo their learning at home. One of the questions that we asked was how worried they were about the impact of the pandemic on their children's education 6 weeks on from the start of the school closures. We found that a quarter were more worried than before, but actually a third were less worried than before, and then 40% had the same amount of worry. We also built on the data that we collected in the first survey. Sorry, David, if you could just go back to the, yeah, thank you. The first survey that we did, where we had that unprompted question about biggest concerns. So we actually gave a list of, I think there were 17 altogether, biggest concerns that parents have. And we asked them to select up to 5. So these were the top 6 concerns that they have. Their child not seeing their friends and socialising was a big one, followed by their child missing out on learning from teachers, 1 or more family members catching coronavirus. My child's mental health came out 4th. My ability to juggle working and support my child's learning was mentioned by a third of parents in their top 5, and how my child will cope going back when schools do reopen. Interestingly, that was another issue that has been flagged up as a big concern for a number of families. So thank you. So the killer question at the time was, when would parents be happy for their child to return to school? So we gave, bearing in mind this was at the end of April, so we gave a list of options, and we did have an other category as well. So people were able to state something else other than these options. So the top option was, I'd feel comfortable with a September return date, but I'd like it to be confirmed now. And that 23% only when the government says it's safe to do so, and another 18% were only when school leaders and teachers say it's safe to do so. Another 10% was as soon as the lockdown ends, which was at the beginning of May, but 10% of the population said that they would only be happy for their children to return to school when staff and pupils at the child's school have been vaccinated against the coronavirus, even if this is in 18 months' time. Another 7%, I'd feel comfortable with a July return date. So it was quite spread out. There's a range of opinions about when parents would be happy to send their children back to school. So anyway, we got the results of this. I turned them out as soon as possible. They got given to the Department for Education. They were shared with the NEU and initially those 2 organisations, and they were taken to the meetings that these people had with the Department for Education. So you know, the one thing that I would say is that all the parents that contributed to our survey, the data was then fed through to all the interested parties. Ultimately, the decision on who was going back was made by the government, but they did have this data from us. It's been the data's been widely used in the Northern Ireland and Welsh governments as well. So that's been really well regarded, and so that's fantastic. We had lots of coverage on it, I think, because we had so many respondents, but also it was just really timely in terms of particularly this last question. So we had lots of coverage, which was fantastic. So that was sort of at the end of April. We're now at the point where this is such a fast moving situation when it comes to getting children returning to school, the whole debate about who goes back and when, and arrangements. We have now just this week launched our third coronavirus survey. We've actually also done a separate one specifically aimed at parents with special needs children. So we'd like to capture their feedback because that's a really interesting demographic that we want to be able to focus on as well. So we've got 2 separate surveys out at the moment. As I said, they were released they were launched on Monday. I haven't set a closing date yet because I want to monitor take up, and we're probably looking at middle of next week when they'll close. In terms of their focus, we're looking at parent and child engagement levels with schooling. It's really interesting because there has been some research that's suggesting that children are less engaged in their learning at the moment. So we would like to see what evidence we can collect on that. Satisfaction with learning support from school. This is a really interesting one because back in our last survey, the satisfaction with learning support from school was really high. I'm not so sure that it's going to be quite so high now. I think that there over the last few weeks there are definitely some parents that are less just getting a little bit frustrated with the lack of online and direct communication that their children are getting from their teachers. So we're asking it in a slightly different way this time. So we'll be able to collect some good data on that. Whether parents are planning to send their children back in September, and also we've asked a question about whether parents would be happy with no social distancing arrangements. Now, I actually wrote that before all the talk about no social distancing this week, but I was really curious to collect data on that. So yeah, so we want to find that out. Interestingly, we want to find out, we want to add to your data on what we think schools should focus on when pupils do return. So obviously there's a big gap in terms of the curriculum learning that children have lost out on. But you know, it's more than that. It's more to do with their health and well-being, and that reconnection with peers and teachers. And for lots of children, for certain year groups, they're going back to a whole new school. So it's that whole, you know, establishing relationships and things like that. So we're asking parents where they feel that school should focus. We're also asking a question this time about how well parents feel the government is handling the education situation during the pandemic. So that will be interesting. Whether parents should decide whether their child attends school next term. So this is in light of the conversations about whether attendance should be mandatory from September. And obviously, again, you know, we wrote that question last week. This week, there's been a lot about, you know, schools will be fining parents. So we just wanted to get parents' reactions on that, and also whether parents would like to be consulted on school reopening arrangements. So that's a flavour of the questions that are in this survey. So I've just on the last slide, I've just given the links to where the surveys are. So if you are able to complete the surveys, if you're a parent, or share the surveys more widely, that would be absolutely fantastic. We have got the 2 survey links are there. Otherwise, you can go via our website at parentkind.org.uk, Also, if you find us on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, we've got posts about it there, which you can like and share amongst your groups. So yeah, if we can get as many people responding, obviously I'm not expecting anything like the number that we had last time, but if we can get as many parents responding, then that gives parents gives us an opportunity to really promote parental voice in this, because as all the speakers have said, it's absolutely crucial to bring parents in on all of this, because there is a feeling that you know, some parents are very anxious about their children going back to school in September, and we need to bring them on board. We need schools to work with parents to encourage children to be back at school if it is safe to do so, because that is the best place for children to be. Yeah, thank you.
Amazing, thank you, Kirsty. What a phenomenal piece of research. 250,000 responses is an unbelievable undertaking from yourself and others. So thank you for joining us to share all of that, and Celeste as well. And I know she's probably jumped off. Thank you for sharing as well. To stick close to the time, I'm going to just wrap things up. But I hope everyone has kind of taken from this how important the voices of children and young people and parents and wider families are in this entire process, and how much we think their voice has been missing from the discussion. And I think it's clearly something that all of our organisations are continuously committed to doing. And for us, it's particularly showcasing and increasing the voice and the amount of advocacy for families and children living in poverty. I think although the pandemic presents us with kind of unique and often extreme challenges, the disproportionate effect that it's having on children in poverty can be alleviated, and it can be addressed through the right combinations of policies and the right combinations of support, so that these children are not excluded from their education and they're not excluded from wider society. So I hope this conversation has shone a light on some of the potential solutions and some of the barriers that are currently being faced. So again, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Kirsty and Celeste for spending the time with us this afternoon. Next week, we're actually going to kind of continue this conversation in a couple of other webinars that we're going to be hosting that are going to practically look at how do we take recommendations to apply them in schools. So they're aimed at whole school communities, and how we can take some of the learning and practically look at it and apply it when schools return in September. So we'll include the links to them when we send around the follow-up, and we'll also make sure to include slides in there as well, so people can have a look through. Finally, I'd just like to thank everyone so much for coming this afternoon. Hope it's been interesting and enlightening, and we just really want to encourage everyone to please get in touch with us if you do have further questions. We'd be more than happy to engage in any of the topics in the report. But yeah, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you all have a great. Take care.
Thank you.